This episode is brought to you by Maps of the Mind and their upcoming 4-hour interactive online workshop on trip sitting, guiding, and organizing solo and group trips. The workshop is called Facilitating Psychedelic Experiences and is happening Saturday, July 2nd, 2022. If you use the promo code JESSO40, Jesso40, that's my last name, plus 40, you will be able to get access to the entire workshop for only £40, which is about 23% off. If you head to the link in the description to this episode or head to jameswjesso.com/July 2022 workshop, July 2022 workshop, you can get all the information about what will be provided to you on the day of it. I will actually be attending, so looking forward to seeing you there. Hello everyone, welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research. Now normally I give a little bit more of a context building statement at the beginning, but actually that's right in the beginning of the interview for today, so I'm going to save it for a couple minutes from now when that interview starts. Also, there isn't really much of an overture for this episode as we normally do, but instead I thought it would make sense to open this episode with a quote from the author we are interviewing, who is AJ Bond. So the quote is this: "We all know shame. It's that unpleasant feeling that makes us think there is something wrong with who we are. It's more than just embarrassment or regret. Shame can shake us to the core, and worst of all, it tells us that we need to be, feel, and act differently in order to be seen, loved, and accepted. But is that true?" End quote. So that's the words of AJ Bond, who we're going to be interviewing for this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Again, an exploration of shame's relationship to psychedelic experiences and the sort of larger curative intention of the show becomes evident in the first 2 minutes of me talking with AJ, so I will save that for when the interview comes in. But I will read his bio. AJ Bond is a Toronto-based writer, filmmaker, and shame educator. After experiencing a life-changing, quote, shame breakthrough, end quote, in therapy several years ago, AJ dedicated himself to educating others about our master emotion through shame ed classes and one-on-one coaching. AJ is certified as a shame healing practitioner by the Center of Healing Shame in Berkeley and has also trained in nonviolent communication and authentic relating. AJ recently published a book about his journey through shame entitled Discomfortable, which is the book we are talking with him about for the podcast today, and he is also a host of a podcast under the same name, Discomfortable. Together, we talk about what shame is, what it feels like, and how it impacts our sense of self and perception of the world. We also talk about healthy versus unhealthy shame, internal versus external shame, attachment style, and shame's link to our developmental past and early relationship with our parents, intimacy, and how shame hinders our ability to truly connect with others, unconditional love and ayahuasca's impact on AJ's healing through shame, and, of course, how to navigate shame in a way that supports healing the wounds around which shame directs us from. So that is a little sense of what's coming up in this interview. Before we jump into it, a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode. Those individuals have been giving substantially, some of which for quite a long time, so thank you very much. A generally big thank you to all my patrons who have continued to support me and the show throughout the difficult process that has been the head injury I incurred back in January and how it has impacted my ability to do this work and release this work, this podcast, and everything that goes into it. So, I mean, any and every podcast creator says, I couldn't do it without you. And that's true. And also explicitly on a deeply personal end, on an existential end, on a deep sort of like meaning of my life, and I really couldn't be doing this without knowing that your support, financial and otherwise, is still going into this work, even in the midst of all of this complexity and at times chaos that's happening for me right now. And I'm truly, truly grateful. As a little tidbit, actually, this interview was the last interview I conducted before the head injury. It actually happened the day after, or like 2 days after the car accident, and the day before the implications of the head injury really hit me. I mean, get it? Like a truck. Bam. So if you are enjoying the show, you're finding value in it, please consider giving back financially to the show. Heading to jameswjesso.com/support will give you a number of options, including purchasing from affiliate companies, buying stuff off the shop, direct one-time donations, or becoming a patron on Patreon. All of those options are much appreciated. So thank you very much in advance for supporting the show financially. Without any further ado, here's my interview with AJ Bond on Adventures Through the Mind, Getting Discomfortable with Shame, episode 162. Enjoy.
Let us just try to be ourselves and get through it, and that's great with me.
Sure. Try to remain authentic and not be too ashamed of not being our absolute best picture of our ideal selves.
Exactly.
Great. So why don't we jump in? Why don't we jump in there? I think that's a good start. Okay. Well, AJ Bond, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I read your book, Discomfortable.
Wow.
What is shame and how can we break its hold? Are you saying wow to all the tabs?
Yeah.
Not to take away your excitement, but I do this for almost every book that I care to pay attention to. And there was some caring with this book, and I felt like it would be relevant to talk about shame, to have you on the show to talk about shame, not only because a lot of the aspects of the book, a lot of the discussions about affect, attachment, childhood conditioning, all of this stuff lines up very well with what we talk about here on Adventures Through the Mind, but also because it seems like with an intention I have with the podcast, which is to help inform the mindset through which and by which we journey with psychedelics to become better people for ourselves, for each other, for the world, for those that follow us after we're gone, this kind of thing. Having a good frame of mind to sort of some central themes in what it is to be human is a really great sort of conceptual orienting points for making sense of those experiences. And shame is obviously a huge part of the human experience. And as your book goes into very deeply, like way more sort of pervasive than I think most people might immediately assume, especially since, and this is maybe me jumping in too quick, too far, but especially since there could be such a situation that we don't know how much shame we're actually holding, because we have shame about that shame. And so the shame hides itself behind itself and then is invisible. So to start us off though, now that this little preamble is set, why don't you introduce exactly what is shame?
It's sort of an ongoing joke that every time I'm asked this question, I say something different, because there's so many different levels or perspectives at which you could look at shame. So each time I'm trying to just really get to the heart of it. And I think where I'm at now is to say that it is an unpleasant sensation that we have in reference to ourselves. So we might feel fear about something external threatening our safety. But shame, and it's a whole spectrum in my mind of emotions in shame. It says there's some threat related to me, who I am, what I'm doing, or how I fit in, because we're such a social animal. So it really is a fascinating emotion because it's about us. It's about our view of ourselves. Does that start to capture it for you? And after having read the book, does that feel like a nice starting point?
Yeah, I do think it's a good starting point, and I'm gonna dig a little bit deeper, specifically into the book, because you outline shame as sort of having two components, a central component and then another component, which sort of comes as a consequence of the central one. So maybe you can outline that. What are the two sort of sides of shame?
Yeah. And so this now is inspired by affect theory. And the idea is that at the core of shame, as you said, there's a feeling, which we're going to call shame affect. And so that is a spectrum of sensations that are unpleasant and that, based on the way they happen, make us look at ourselves and our position. And then on top of that feeling, we start to use our cognitive brain to make sense of it. So we create these very powerful stories, beliefs, messages as to what that feeling, shame affect, means when we feel it. And so those two parts kind of get wired together in our child brain, is the theory. And from then on, when you feel, I'm imagining that with the spectrum of shame, it's more like when you feel a certain amplitude of shame in a certain kind of situation, it brings online a belief that I am bad, or I am unworthy, or I am different, I'm alone. Something like that is often the interpretation. But at different amplitudes and in slightly different social situations, we might interpret it slightly differently. But at the core, it tends to be an unpleasant feeling that makes me look at myself and decide there's something wrong with me. Maybe I don't fit in.
Mm-hmm. And that the feeling tone is sort of the central part. The secondary, the cognitive effects, they're sort of the interpretive lens upon which we sort of put onto which we put those feelings, which are learned throughout life.
Exactly. And I think a big part of why we pretty universally interpret it as I am bad is because it is an unpleasant feeling. Simple as that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things you wrote about, I think, was it from Narcissism? One of Shame and Pride was one of the primary reference texts you had in your book, and you talked about how there's sort of I don't know if I'm using the right word here, but sort of a universal act or like universal consequence of feeling shame in humans, which is like a loss of muscle tone, which causes the sort of head to droop and the eyes to avert eye gaze as well.
Yeah, it's Donald Nathanson, and there's some debate about the actual universality of these emotional reactions, but he definitely observed a theme of collapsing inward, avoiding eye contact, particularly because the muscle tone in the back of the neck goes away, so your head naturally looks down, a kind of constricting of the throat so that you naturally don't speak. And some people, like one of my mentors at the Center for Healing Shame, Brett Lyon, actually calls shame both an emotion and a freeze state. So to some extent, we kind of often freeze in shame, and the whole thing stops us from behaving however we were just behaving, because there's been some cue that triggered shame to say, this behavior might be dangerous. Let's shut it down. So this person just sort of like folds into a little ball and freezes, and hopefully then comes up with a safer strategy. That's what our evolution is trying to do, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, that speaks to, two questions that I've been holding that I thought would be cool to explore. One of which is around shame as an impediment to the yes feeling. And the other of which is the role shame plays in our disposition as social animals. So both of those questions, I'm sort of like, I'm sending at you now, and I'll let you address them in whatever order that you feel appropriate.
Yeah. Well, let's just sort of lay out this shame as an impediment theory, and then you'll probably have to remind me what part of that interested you. But the idea, and this is again from affect theory, is that shame actually originally developed as a way to get rid of pleasant emotions in our body. And the way I think of it is that the pleasant emotion is driving us towards some kind of action. It's saying, do this. But then when we sense that thrust and that action might actually be dangerous based on social cues, perhaps, then shame comes in and wipes out that pleasant feeling and replaces it with an equal amount of unpleasantness in order to stop that motivation, to kind of like freeze us in our tracks, to protect us from making a kind of social mistake, as it were. So can you remind me of like what part of that was the most interesting for you?
Well, I mean, what was interesting for me was about essentially what you described, how shame sort of comes in to replace a yes feeling with a no feeling, and the no feeling being associated not to what the individual wants, but to what the perception of the social circumstances asks of the individual. And that it's like the no feeling comes in to be like, oh, because if I continue with this yes feeling, there might be a social consequence. And the social consequence might be, that I am rejected and so on and so forth, right? That I am excluded. In your book, you talk a lot about belonging. And so that's why I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then that also relates to being a social animal, because why would we neurobiologically, evolutionarily have this circuit in us to do this sort of replacing the yes with the no, if the belonging to the group was not a fundamentally important part of us as an animal, but as an animal essentially. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it is to me endlessly fascinating how fundamental being social is to everything about a human. Like, it's not just that we like to be social. We are deeply social in every way. It's like all of our motivations and our evolution has been tuned around this kind of like super survival strategy, in my mind, of belonging. And so many of our needs will actually get kind of left to the side in order to pursue belonging. And shame is a kind of perfect example of that. I might want to fulfill my need for food, but then at this dinner party, shame is like comes in and diminishes my excitement to eat, so that I don't rudely, push ahead and have make an embarrassment of myself. So I just got slightly distracted because my computer is doing something strange. Can you still hear me?
You are. There's something strange happening, but not disruptively happening. So I think you're okay. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Or at least not on my end. It's disruptive. Clearly it was disruptive because we had to take a pause here, but nothing is negatively impacting the recording technically.
Okay. You can edit that out or leave it in, whichever feels.
I don't know. Would you feel ashamed of yourself if I left it in?
No, there is a little bit of shame coming up in this moment. Because as my computer gave me this message, I sort of lost my train of thought. And then the shame is like, oh no, I'm going to look bad on this podcast. I'm not going to look smart. I'm going to let James down. The audience might judge me. So there's a bit of shame that came in, and it's fascinating because it's telling me not to tell you about it. It's like, don't tell him there's shame, but try to bluff your way through this. In fact, don't even mention that you got distracted, So there's like a little bit of shame in this moment, telling me to do things to please you and to fit in. So because I would die otherwise, right? In theory. That's what my body thinks.
Cold and alone, out into the wild, out into the undomesticated wild reality of chaos. Yeah. So wait, let's get back to what you're talking about. You were talking about the role shame is playing as like in our social, in the necessity of our socialness as humans.
Yeah. I mean, when we were hunter-gatherers, the theory is that we could not survive alone. So in that context, shame as an evolutionary force makes complete sense. It teaches us to adopt the norms of our group, which are not only for our belonging in the group, but for everyone in the group's survival. So shame in that context is extremely important. You want to make sure that you don't, leave food scraps out around where the tribe lives, because it could attract predators. So there's probably a lot of shame around certain behaviors like that both keeps you safely in the group and keeps the group safe. And if someone simply cannot adapt to those norms and those safety strategies, then they might have to be let out for the safety of everyone else. And I think that is sort of akin to when shame tells us we're a burden and we're bringing everyone down. So there is sort of like the aspect of shame that encourages us to withdraw and isolate ourselves and exile ourselves, and can even lead into things like suicidal ideation. I think connect back to, as hunter-gatherers, this balance between shame motivating us to stay in the group and learn the norms, but then if we can't, to kind of save everyone else to protect the group who we love. So I think that's the evolutionary backbone, but it continues to this day with that exact same intensity. And our instincts have no realization, because it's happened so quickly, that we live in a completely different world in which that notion of I should kill myself to save the people I love is almost now never true.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you say it happened so quickly, but also like that quickly is something, whatever, we'll just say 10,000 years or however long it is that we've been, but like we're talking however many hundreds of thousands of years to get to the sort of anatomically, like evolutionary expression of humans as we are now. And when you're talking about, like, you had made the food example, and then you're making another example about getting kicked out of the tribe. And I was thinking about, like, somewhere in the middle, like being young and then having like shame teach you that it's really not appropriate to just like randomly pull your penis out of nowhere and just play with it because it feels like a great idea. That's good learning, right?
Yeah.
And that shame in this plays this positive utility role that actually can be, quite generative. And Absolutely. It can also, you extended it, it could also go as far as somebody being in a state where they feel as though they need to kill themselves because there's so much shame there. I mean, this could be unnecessary reductionism, so broad brushstrokes, so there could be a lot going on there, right? But shame could be like deeply wrapped up in this. So maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of healthy shame versus not so healthy shame. And as like a little bonus, if you can weave in there something about how shame and the beliefs around shame can get wrapped up into our identity and who we believe ourselves to be, then I would give you like extra bonus points that don't actually exist except in this moment for being able to pull that off.
Okay. I'll try to hold all that in my brain. Yeah. I think that at the core of shame, as I talk about in the book, is based on these kind of expectations we start to form about ourselves, who we are, and what our competencies are, what we can do. And any time we perceive that we don't live up to those competencies or identities of ourselves, our body creates shame as a kind of warning. Like, you're not doing the thing that you have come to associate as you being a safe member of the group. So I have to warn you of this. And so in that comparison, there's like kind of like naturally a kind of hierarchy of, okay, there was like a perfect me who could do all these things. And then there's this me who doesn't seem to have achieved that. And it's very easy to associate the real you with this bad feeling and come away feeling like there's something fundamentally off about you forever. And that is a maladaptive way to look at shame, because it actually says you can't change. There's nothing you can do here. You just basically have to hide it and hope that no one notices so you don't get kicked out. And then there's another side of shame where you are able to see this comparison and notice that it's really about actions. And it's not so much that you're trapped in the bad feeling, is that this bad feeling is about a specific action in time, and that you have all this potential to learn from that mistake and grow and figure out how to deal with it. So then on that interpretation of shame, it's so generative. You can, like, that's one of the best qualities a human has, is that we can learn and adapt and grow and figure out how in the future to deal with this situation that we just didn't quite know how to deal with in the past. So you can see on one side, it's like the strategy is hide. And on the other side, the strategy is like learn and grow. And I think The hide side makes a lot of sense when you think of it as a social emotion, because it's like, well, if no one knows that I have this problem, then I won't get kicked out, so I can just hide it. And that harkens back more to a hunter-gatherer type situation. Whereas in the modern world, if revealing that you're struggling with a mistake you made and that you're still learning how to do something that's kind of socially important, if that gets you rejected by someone, you live in a world like with access to billions of people, so you can actually find new people to connect with. And it therefore becomes a motivation towards even deeper connection in your life, an even better sense of belonging. People who see your flaws and accept you anyway. The other side is the exact opposite again. It's like, I'm going to hide this mistake. I'm going to be inauthentic. And my body's always going to know that my belonging is tenuous. And that, I think, just saps our sense of meaning and pleasure in life. So those are kind of like two aspects of healthy and unhealthy shame. And then there's also an aspect of external versus internal. So on the side where I'm hiding something, I'm very much gearing the whole judgment of my life around what everyone else thinks. So that leads into a whole bunch of problematic behaviors where you don't have your own values. You're adopting the values from outside. And you're often getting into a place of people pleasing, which is the story of my life. And you're trying to basically gear your whole life to pleasing other people. So in that sense, in terms of the identity question, you can be completely distanced from who you really are by shame, and have created this whole mask and persona of whatever in your group is like acceptable. So that is a very lonely place to be. Even if you are so popular in it, deep down, you know that it's not really you. Even if it's unconsciously, I think you deeply know that you're not really in full belonging, and your body is not going to reward you as such. And then on this other side, you're being honest, you're working and growing, you're finding the people who get and accept that honesty. And you're building this wonderful sense of self-awareness, self-acceptance, group acceptance, and an identity that you're discovering. It's like, who am I? And whoever I am, that's okay. So does that kind of answer both sides of it?
Yeah, I think so. Although I missed something there, because you were also talking, you were saying like, oh, it could be positive or negative, but it could also be internal and external. And then you explain the internal being like, oh, okay, so I get everybody, I try to accord to everyone else's needs and everyone else's judgments and all the rest. And that can be inauthentic. It leads to this inauthentic thing. But I could do this other thing, which is positive, and they could lead to these positive sense of belonging. But then what I think I might have missed there, or maybe you missed it, / maybe I don't understand, is that I thought you were going to speak to then how shame can become externalized, wherein we do sort of the opposite, where we bolster ourselves to be very, very big and start to become extremely judgmental and negative against others and create disingenuous relationships led by shame, by ensuring all the people around us actually agree and support our sort of delusionally propped up sense of ourselves. Does that?
Yeah, that I think I didn't quite communicate that when I said internal versus external, it was the source of judgment and values.
Yeah.
So the external, what I'm calling, is when we're hiding our stuff. So I could see why you would conceive that as the internal. Whereas on the other side, it was that I am internally motivated by my own internal values, my own internal authenticity. That's how I guide my life. But it's very true that on the side where the external judgment and values control you, some of the big strategies that come up are similar to what you're describing, something like narcissism, where I am running from this deep core of shame with such hypervigilance that it's a constant public relations campaign of trying to prove my value to everyone, including myself, at every moment, which can come across as like boasting, blustering, or could be, as you suggested, a kind of machismo, a constant kind of quote unquote masculine archetype of strength that is almost it sometimes feels sort of like methinks thou dost protest too much, because it's motivated from its own internal engine of the opposite. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. That it's like it's an extreme compensation for a deep sense of not being, say, good enough, by making sure that I and everyone around me knows that I'm not only good enough, I'm the best.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And you said narcissism. In the book, you take quite a bit of time to nuance about narcissism, how you're using it. Because if you could imagine this, a lot of people in the world, a lot of people on the internet throw out clinical terms left and right to all sorts of things as if they knew what those clinical disorders actually were, and that somebody expressing any measure of this thing according to their experience of them marks them as being this clinically defined, so on and so forth. Yeah. Narcissist, for example. But that's not necessarily how you're using. You're using it a little bit more loosely. Can you sort of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I really see a lot of low-key narcissistic tendencies in me. And as I point out in the book, I'm not talking about narcissistic personality disorder, which, as I understand it, is actually quite rare. But there are narcissistic sort of traits that I think we all have to varying degrees. And I noticed that I have a lot of them. And so I just really wanted to explore and normalize, very perhaps in a reaction to what you're saying, because narcissism and calling people toxic is such a shaming label that is directed a lot, especially on the internet and social media. And it felt really important to normalize that and kind of collectively share in it. So we all have some of these traits that someone might experience as toxic. And we all have traits that are somewhat narcissistic. I'd much rather that we look at that in ourselves. And every time I have a desire to call someone else an asshole, I'm like, what's the utility of that? I want to turn that around, and I don't want to call myself an asshole, but I want to explore and own the ways in which I could be asshole-like. Does that make sense? Because that just feels like it's so much more healing in terms of self-awareness, and it's counter-shaming the culture that is throwing these terms around so viciously and kind of unfairly.
Yeah, and I don't suspect that it's to normalize the, sometimes substantially harmful outcomes of certain narcissistic behaviors, but to normalize the fact that we all express it to some degree or another. In fact, in the research, there's such a thing as a healthy level of narcissism, which is which is like associated to having a healthy amount of self-esteem, to be like, yes, I am a valuable person and a valuable member of a community because of this, and this reason. That's sort of like, that can be a healthy amount of narcissism until it becomes increasingly decoupled from how actually valuable you are to a community, and how that ripples out into your behavior. So yeah, I do appreciate you commenting or exploring that about narcissism, and also the sort of like that exploration itself was sort of on a higher level of abstract, addressing a trend of a kind of weird. It's like kind of a weird externalization of shame in some sense that's happening, especially in internet culture.
Yeah. And I think that happens a lot. You mentioned this externalization in terms of like a form of projecting our shame essentially onto everyone else. I think that is extremely common. Not only do we project our shame in the sense of, oh, I don't have shame, you do, but shame also does this sort of clever, once removed projection, wherein I take my deepest insecurities and I project them through your eyes back onto me. And it's like every human I look at, I perceive that they see my flaws so clearly. So there's another like trick that shame can play with I quoted Jay Shetty in the book, this idea of the perception of a perception. And I think shame is deeply involved in our perceptions of people's perceptions. That's sort of like what shame is.
Yeah, I mean, you could even bring like another level of abstraction there, which is like, and you can bring on board like a recognition of how that shame you're holding or whatever it is, has incurred some kind of wounds, and those wounds come from a particular thing that's not that specific person. It could be sort of a social system. It could be sort of a pattern of interactions over time that you may or may not have been contributing to the to the scenarios that unfolded. But either way, there's like this other level of like, and I recognize how this is a consequence of being harmed by a particular thing. And then it further feeds into the perception. And then it's not just like, then it's like it's your fault about all of this thing. This whole complex of things. Which I get it, like it's very disempowering to not feel like we have somebody to launch out at for all the things that we've hurt for. But also the people who hurt us really are only accountable for how they have hurt us, not how we've been hurt similarly in one form or another throughout the course of our lives.
Yeah. And that now you're really tapping into a big iceberg of shame and trauma here, which I think is so important. Like we're feeling shame in theory all the time, varying little degrees that are helping us make decisions and be who we want to be. But it's when it really, I think, becomes problematic is when it's connected to a shame trigger from the past, which is sort of like what you're describing. Some basically a moment of developmental trauma in our childhood where our needs were not met. And we had this deep expectation that our caregivers would meet our needs. And when that doesn't happen, we blame ourselves. So it's like, we have shame and it gets triggered by expectation and it gets rid of the yes feeling. Like there's all of that. But at the core, it really does come down to a moment in our childhood, moments perhaps, where our needs are not met. And the only way our brain can understand it is to say, this is my fault. So we go into shame and we wire our brain around that belief to some extent. And then as an adult, something triggers that wiring and that whole reality comes back online, takes over our sense making, makes that person into some kind of horrible enemy, as you pointed out, because they are now, indicted by this whole trauma from our childhood. And that is a very scary place to be because our brain has literally been taken over and changed by childhood sense making that is no longer almost certainly useful or accurate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could be externalized. It could also be internalized. Like it's,
totally.
It's like, it's your fault or I'm the worst. And then this is how you can get into what you said earlier, shame leading someone to end up ultimately killing themselves. I'm going to have to remember to put a warning at the beginning of this episode that we talk about suicide, not thoroughly, but it's there. It can be quite upsetting for some people. Yeah. And also there was something else that you said there about the child. It's like, it's my fault. Like children are egocentric, that like all of reality is around them. That's a part of the brain development. That's normal. That's healthy, but it also means two things. One, that at that age, we're entirely dependent on our parents or our caregivers. Right. And two, everything's about us. So if something is happening, we're harmed by a lack of what we need or an overabundance of things that are not good for us, right? Because one of our fundamental needs is to not be physically abused, right? So if we get physically abused, well, then we've been, we're emotionally abused or whatever. Well, that need for not being abused has not been met, right?
Yeah. So, but it can also be too much of a good thing. It's like I have my need to be able to make decisions isn't met. That can be like you said, there's that two sides, the neglect and the overfunctioning.
Sure.
Both of those sides.
Sure. Yeah. And so then if that goes wrong, then it's about me. But also since our parents, it's funny because I just watched a School of Life on this, a School of Life video that I was like, oh yeah, I remember this whole theory now, which is that like the adults, we need them to be the people we can trust. Right. And so we'll actually make it about us instead of make it about our parents or our caregivers fucking up. Because it's safer for us to be the problem than the sort of like gods of our safety to be the problem. And this is happening generally. It's happening way earlier than we have the capacity to recognize we've been thinking these things.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you're in that moment, you cannot conceive of this godlike character making a mistake, being wrong. It has to be me. And it's also, I think, the safest, as you said, because I can't conceive of how to control an adult to get what I want, but I can blame myself and adapt around to survive this situation. So in that sense, I get the evolutionary importance of this moment of self-shaming, but it can become so chronic and deep that you carry it around for your whole life. This belief, I mean, this is my life. I carry around a chronic belief that I don't belong. It's just in there. It always has been, and perhaps it always will be. And I'm sort of in a phase of awareness and management and acceptance of that. And I am hopeful that gradually through awareness, self-acceptance, and management, it will shift. We have some plasticity. But if I think it has to shift, that's a prison of shaming my own shame, and it's not very productive because I don't get to decide how quickly or when or if ever the deepest, most fundamental wirings that make up my sense of self will shift. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I feel like I want to speak to the possible interpretation of what we're talking about as being some kind of victim blaming as well. That it's like, oh, you're just carrying around your own wounds as a victim and blaming everyone else, because obviously that can be true, but it also can very well be true that a person was very harmed by very real things that are very much still happening, and that to identify them, point them out, and to be like, no, this is a no stop don't moment against these things isn't necessary. The fact it has to be coupled with sort of that internal management, but it's not that the external sort of like call out and pointing to is sort of like not doing the work or something. Because when you're talking about like, okay, so the family malnourished or over provided one thing or another, positive or negative, whatever. It's like, well, why does that family do that? Well, there's intergenerational factors, but there's sociocultural factors. If there's sort of an implicit prejudice or sort of, violent behavior that exists in a family, then almost definitely that's associated with a larger cultural thing. And so when you leave the family, it's in you now. You're hypervigilant, sensitive to it. You have all these triggers, but you're also going to find that very real thing out in the world as well, because it's not like it only existed in your family, because a family doesn't exist in a vacuum. And like, for example, and I'll go into your own story the best I can remember. So pardon me if I get it wrong. You internalize quite a bit of homophobia in your life as a child, but it wasn't that like, because it only existed in your family and now you're just like delusional and thinking it's in the rest of the world. Well, it also existed in the rest of the world as well, right? So actually, maybe that would be a great point for you to sort of expand on what I was just saying there, criticize or push back or whatever, in speaking to your own story.
Yeah, that's a great idea. The first thing that kind of struck me was this victim blaming mentality. And my reaction to that is that, looking at myself, it's actually the opposite. It's that I'm not blaming anyone, really. I'm blaming myself still. And that's the problem. I'm carrying around this story that I am flawed and always to blame for everything that goes wrong. So I can tell you in theory that, maybe my needs weren't met somehow, but deep down, I am still blaming me. And that is the issue. And it's very delicate here because you're right. It's impossible to perfectly raise a child. It's impossible. So there will always be these moments of trauma. So there's like this balance to be had here where on a deep level, we want to really honor that it's what I am blaming myself for is not my fault. It doesn't mean I have to go and yell at my parents right now, but there is some utility in there to seeing how other people or even culture at large contributed for the simple fact that it will relieve the self-blame, which is really empowering. And I've seen this happen in coaching sessions where you really get to a level where you've convinced someone that wasn't your responsibility and it wasn't your fault. And there's this like, wow moment of relief to really like get that for the first time. But is there a lot of utility to then going and blaming your parents 30, 40 years later? Maybe not. So there is a balance of seeing how this wasn't your fault, but also recognizing that what's really the problem is your brain. It really is all the way your sense making. It might be about your relationship with your parents right now, but what we do know for sure is that it's the sense making patterns wired into your brain that are really holding you back. So we want to like liberate ourselves from that, but we also want to honor, I think you're saying, this is the way my brain constructed it. This is the way I contributed also by coming up with these stories and holding on to them. So there is I don't want to be in self-blame, but to just have that clarity that it's about the way I look at my parents and society in my head that has actually superseded, for me at least, what my actual relationship with my parents and society is in reality as an adult. And a big part of it is just really seeing that I am now an adult. That's the huge difference. I am not a helpless child anymore. So I don't need to be blamed for everything. And I now have so much agency to completely change my relationship with my parents or with the world. So I think those are kind of the two aspects that are important to keep in mind, so as to not lose yourself in blaming someone else, but also not be trapped forever in blaming yourself. Mm-hmm. Does that sort of answer it?
I think it does. It's still sort of, there's still this component, which, I'm not an authority on this. I don't know. These are just my ideas, and my ideas, I reserve the right for my ideas to change as I learn more over time, which
I
is
love
that,
Me too.
and that there are still things happening in the external world that are require address, right? So for example, if your parents are still acting a certain way and it's still hurting you, there's this liberation that you're talking about, right? But if the pattern is still ongoing, then there needs to be something that happens. And if we're going about it still stuck in that sort of that wounded reaction, then not entirely never, but the likelihood is that the process that we're trying to undergo to resolve it is not likely to lead to an actual resolution, but an exacerbation of the same dynamics that are underneath why we were harmed in the first place. And this is with our parents. And something similar might be with regards to different things in society. For example, violent dictatorships overthrown by violent revolutions breed violent dictatorships, for example, that the process, like the internal disposition from which we engage in a process to resolve a thing that is actively conflicting in our lives, is a significant contributor to how that process will unfold and what its outcome will be. And if we're not conscientious of that, we might accidentally generate the very outcome we were trying to liberate ourselves from, either by imposing it into the process or having it be the actual outcome, even if we feel like we won. We've just flipped it now, and it's this other person is. I don't know if that last part made sense, but that's kind of what I'm holding.
Yeah. We have. We see examples, just as you said, all the time of enacting the injustice on the source of the injustice, which ultimately is the same injustice, somewhat more earned perhaps, but equally problematic, and is not therefore liberating us, nor could it be conceived as reconciliation, for example. And so I do think, in my mind, like as I hear that, I think the self-awareness piece is what would be missing in situations like that, wherein we're not able to see how our own trauma is. I think it's so hard, because when we're trying to make redress, perhaps with your parents, you're going to get triggered into the brain of this neglected or, invaded child. And that's going to completely skew how you go about solving the situation. So I think it's so important for us to develop the self-awareness and the skills to see when we're in shame and to see when we're in a trigger or a trauma state, and to be able to skillfully look beyond it so that we don't just enact the same pattern all over again, or either do the same dance with our parents forever, or take their role and do the same dance in reverse, which is sort of what I think you're describing. But for me, when I can see that I'm triggered and it is completely blinding me from what's actually happening in the present moment, that is the place of the most generative solution making. To say, oh, I'm triggered. I'm going to need to take a half-hour break. Or I'm going to talk through what it's like to be triggered. And we're going to explore the sense making of it under the safe sense of this isn't reality right now. I'm triggered. I can tell physically. And to your point, it's all rooted in a physical self-awareness from the very beginning, to tell when I'm riding a wave of activation or discomfort, and to see that that is not the way my brain would think if I didn't have that uncomfortable motivation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Does that sort of address it, do you think, this self-awareness piece?
I think so too. I mean, it gets very we'll say like muddy and convoluted and sort of maybe not treacherous, precarious, to then try to extend that out into thinking about sort of the impact of larger systemic issues on people. And fair enough, because they're bigger, so they're more complex, obviously. Yeah. So and yes, and you know, there was something else that came up while you're talking around, oh no, I hope I don't lose it. Well, shit, it's gone, AJ. Maybe it'll come back in a few minutes. I'll just
what does that feel like? Is there some shame there?
Well, I mean, no, not really. I'm just gonna, I don't think so. If I look for it, I might find some, but I'm just gonna put it into the associative processes of the back of my mind and let my working memory complete it for me. Yeah. So then where do we go from here? What was the last thing you were saying? I apologize. What was the last thing you were saying?
Well, we were talking about the self-awareness to see when you're triggered, such that you don't get stuck in that pattern or enact the injustice in reverse. And you were bringing it to a systemic level, which I think is really juicy. And I was trying in my own brain to say, like, okay, how do I relate to systemic heteronormativity? And how do I not create the same pattern in reverse? And for me, it's like, it requires empathy. That's what's coming up for me, is in order to not just completely burn it all down, I also need to have some empathy for the people that are enacting the system I want to change. And somebody said, like, if you want to change a community, I forget who it was, maybe it was Adrienne Marie Brown. If you want to change a community, you need to be a part of that community. So it's like, if I want to change a heteronormative world to make it less homophobic, I need to kind of join in and empathetically connect with straight people who might be even homophobic. I mean, I think we all are still. So I want to kind of like join and be empathetic. And I think from that place of connection and empathy is where meaningful, useful change will occur that will not be just repeating the same old thing. That's what I take from the systemic version of this.
Yeah, totally. I think our thoughts on that are very aligned. And then the how and what that looks like specifically to each sort of context and thing that's being addressed is different, but certainly unfair for me to think that I would know what any of those specific actions are, especially if they're happening to demographics of people of whom I am not, and I have never experienced what they're going through.
Yeah, and I want to also note, sometimes empathy and connection is if there's actual violence or something. Like, I'm sure there's probably specific scenarios in which it's like, nope, that's not the strategy. So I want to name that as well.
Right. At some point, empathy and connection needs to take a back seat while physical action is taken to prevent violence. And I mean, that's part of what anger is for. You don't talk about anger too much, I think, in the book, or at least I can't remember. but anger as sort of an emotion that allows us to mobilize energy to protect our boundaries. That it's like, as a healthy thing, that is great if we can manage it. If it doesn't blow up into rage, we can utilize that to protect boundaries, protect the boundaries of others. Great. And one of the things go ahead.
Well, I was just going to note that the reason anger is not mentioned a lot in the book is that I am conditioned away from anger. I have a ton of shame about anger. So that shame and anger, that's like probably a future book journey that I'm on because I completely internalized that I'm to blame for everything. So as this people-pleasing, self-protective thing came online, shame actually diminishes and hides my anger. I can't even see it or find it. So I just wanted to name that.
Interesting. One of the thing I wanted to interesting, like not like from a clinical, like making notes in my research journal, but like interesting, like thank you for sharing. I feel like I can relate to that. Although I also feel like in a pretty good relationship with my anger at this point in my life.
I'm getting there.
And there was something else you were saying, about how this whole process of sort of I can't remember exactly, self-awareness, self-accountability, shifting the way by which you show up to the process to create a different outcome than the reiteration of the same things that you're trying to change. In that there's a possibility for shame to come back in and be like, oh, and you're not doing it right. And see,
shame is so like clever. It always finds a way to shame you for everything. There's just it's waiting behind every corner. Like even your most effective solution to shame will then have some new shame that curls out at the tail and is like, oh, but you should have done this years ago, or oh, but like someone else knows about this, so you're not valuable anymore. Like there's just so many ways that shame will capitalize on anything that we find valuable. And it is about accepting and noticing that as well. It's just, for me, it's shame all the way down. And it's just, oh, right, I have to accept this shame too. Oh, right, I have to notice and accept the shame about that thing as well. And the shame about the shame about the shame. And it's just like, how many times can I catch myself shaming myself and then be like, oh, right, okay, now I see you. It's okay. I don't believe you anymore, but it's fine that you're here. I hear you. I see you. Something like that. And that is also the only way that I will not, I cannot connect with you and empathize with you or some other unless I have that skill with myself, I think. Or I could, but it would be inauthentic. I can inauthentically connect with you, but to deeply connect with, and when I'm saying you, I actually mean, we were talking about like connecting with the other in that systemic sense. To connect with the other in an authentic and deep way, I need to be comfortable with my own shame and accepting of my own shame, because otherwise I will not be able to accept someone towards whom I feel opposition or judgment or disconnection, because it's inherently a shame comes up when there's disconnection or judgment.
Right. And I mean, you can still be probably quite authentic and in connection with people and that be the case if the things that you're connecting about aren't things that bring up any kind of shame.
Exactly. Right? Totally. Yeah. Yes.
But then even, I mean, I think a deep enough connection, this is something that my partner and I, Alicia and I, we both really have on board, is recognizing like the deeper into intimacy you get, like to be intimate is to be close. Right. So we talk about intimacy in a lot of ways. Not her and I, yes, we do, but like society, we talk about intimacy in different ways. The language is used, but in a deep, like monogamous partnership, the intimacy grown there is a kind of intimacy where we almost begin to interpenetrate each other's minds. Like she gets to know me so well that she will see me in ways that I don't even want to see myself. Right. She will see the things that I don't want others to see, or I think that I'm okay with her seeing, until all of a sudden she's aware of it, and vice versa. Yeah. And that in any proper intimacy, the things that we are ashamed of will ultimately come up. And there's a profound healing that can unfold if the relational container, the sort of deep relational architecture that holds it, allows for, at least eventually, to a positive sort of like return to co-regulation, to care, to loving, to compassion, to learning, this growth mindset that you talk about in the book. And by eventually, I mean, like, some things come up, and for the first like 10 minutes, it could be getting really hot. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, we're in an argument now. Like, that's like, we got to shift into a different mode because we're in a conflict. Let's go into conflict management kind of thing. And like learn, like, where are we each coming from, and like to build that kind of intimacy. And shame's going to come up there no matter what. Right. And I think, to me, that's part of being in a deeply intimate, monogamous partnership, is to like support each other through that, which also speaks to something else, which is that you're talking quite a bit about like self-awareness and self-responsibility and self-management. But if shame is a social thing that we're developing because of our social thing, our needs for belonging, well, our ability to regulate and survive in life, including how we heal from shame, is not just about me. It also has to exist in relationship. It can't exist solely on the other, but it has to exist in relationship as well. There's a relational component that's necessary to all healing. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. And I like that you pointed out, because there's a bit of a bias in the book, which I mention at a certain point, which comes from where I'm at and where I'm moving to, I think, in my attachment style. And, I talk about this I-we polarity, where as a social animal, we have powerful needs on the I side. Like, I have to keep my individual human body alive. But then, as you noted, like, we're just fundamentally social animal. So we have these powerful needs on the we side of belonging and co-regulation and helping to meet each other's needs. And many of us kind of get pushed or polarized to one side of the polarity as being the safest side. So I interpret myself as a child of collaboratively with my family and culture deciding, okay, I'm going to go all we. I'm going to be all about kind of like group, social, fitting in. And then the downside is I'm neglecting the I side. So the book is sort of like me describing the learnings I've had moving from one side of the polarity to the other. So for me, who already had the social side kind of set, it was so important to realize, I need autonomy. I need self-love. I need self-respect. I need self-awareness, all those things. So the book has a sort of slant in that way. But to be fair, there are many people who will be on the other side, and they went more avoidant attachment. That was safer. So they kept distance, they kept privacy, they kept space. And so for that person, they have an opportunity to go on a journey of rebalancing. That's what it is in my mind, is rebalancing our safety strategy so that it includes the strengths of both sides of the polarity. So their opportunity is to lean more into, what if I did ask for help? What if I did vulnerably open up and get some empathy? And so that side, as you point out, is so fundamentally important. In fact, it seems like a bit of a mind trick, but both sides of that polarity, like going social or going into the I think are ultimately about belonging, because I think belonging kind of trumps our autonomy to some degree, in that as a hunter-gatherer, we couldn't really survive alone. That's my understanding. So I think that autonomy, even though it's like such a huge I need, is still under the umbrella and in service of belonging in a strange, almost paradoxical way.
Can we pause right there? My phone is ringing and it shouldn't be, so just give me a second.
Okay.
Well, AJ, that was actually with regards to the car accident I spoke about, and this conversation is going to need to end very quickly because there is a confusion happening with my car that has been shipped to a place. So we'll sort of like leave that. And I'm sorry for interrupting you. I'm going to probably leave this in too, because like, I think it sort of speaks to the, like including an entire conversation unless necessary. If you're like, can I go to the bathroom? I'll probably cut that out. But like, yeah, anyways. So
I like that.
Yeah. So, I'd love to ask you about, I really wanted to get into talking about like how to overcome shame. And I wanted to ask you about self-improvement shame, which maybe I'll just like leave that as a little tidbit for people to wonder about rather than have you tell them, which is like how shame can start to inform and sort of contort our efforts towards self-improvement. So I'll just let people chew on that. You have a great explanation of it in the book, but they could read it if they really want to know your opinion.
Yeah.
And the third thing I wanted to know was I wanted to speak about ayahuasca because you spoke specifically into the book, and I believe that you just mentioned like, oh, I had to come to a place of like self-love. And if I remember correctly, ayahuasca played an important part of that. So maybe with, like apologetic respect to finishing up, not in a rush, but soon. I'd love to hear a little bit about that ayahuasca self-love experience for you and how it played into your shame journey, and then end with your basic toolkit for people who might want to leave this interview and start working with their own shame. So let's start with the ayahuasca there.
Yeah, there was so much. Now that I look back, it was actually more profound than I even realized, the ayahuasca journey. And the real heart of it was that I was confronted by these terrifying monsters, really. And they were always also, interestingly, connected to like big bouts of nausea. So I really got to see very clearly that like the real seeming fears of the world are deeply connected to the sensations my body is producing. And then not only that, but the shaman was like, surrender. Everything is perfect here. Surrender. So I would always walk towards this terrifying apparition in my mind. And when I got there, it always turned out to be okay. These like terrifying dogs that were going to kill me. I got towards them and then they just were like friendly and they were licking me, and the nausea went away. And so over and over again, I had this lesson of moving towards not only fear, but discomfort, bodily discomfort. And in this space of moving towards it and accepting it and looking at it, it melted away into relief and bliss. Over and over again, this happened. And that to me is a nice window into how we can work with things like fear and shame, is to get curious about them and to walk towards them with love and openness and acceptance and be like, hey, what are you all about? And discover that once they've sort of had their moment to say, I feel blah, that they go, and they're done. And there's like a space of clarity and relief after the acceptance of the pain that then I can operate from so clearly and make really actually informed decisions from a place of logic and values rather than shame or fear. So that's sort of answering your last question a little bit early. But then the self-love piece was at the end as the ayahuasca was sort of fading. And it was like I realized there weren't going to be no more monsters because it was just down to a tingle. And then I was just flooded with relief of what an amazing experience it had been. And it was just felt like love. I just felt like, wow, I have never felt this much concentrated, what feels like unconditional love. And I was just playing in it like it was a pool. It was like, what if I brought in this person who I hate? And in that pool of Mama Ayahuasca's unconditional love, I was like, oh, you know what? That person's trying so hard. And it was like, I probably owe them an apology. And so I was just bringing everything into this love. And then the next day I was like, but wait, something's missing. And it feels like I don't love myself. Like there's this unconditional love that I'm giving out to everyone and everything. But it's like I don't have that unconditional love for me. And I like burst into tears and it felt so true. And that was sort of like my mission for the next 6 months was like, how does it make sense that there's like this opportunity for unconditional love, but I don't get to share in it? And it kind of came to a conclusion on this beautiful moment as the sun was setting on a ferry heading to Costa Rica, where I realized, wait, that's absurd. I have all this love for the world and for people and for memories and for things and for books and for movies. Like, it's just factually incorrect to say that I don't love myself. I love when I interact with that book. I love when I watch that movie. I love my relationship with this person who I love. I love my contribution to that memory. And so I just started to realize that like everything outside of me that I love is something that I contributed to in a deep way. And it wouldn't even be loved without me. So I reframed love. I was like, any love is a form of self-love. And so that little nugget now, whenever I feel like so much love towards someone, if I remind myself, oh, AJ, this is about you too, it feels so true. And it's like, oh yeah, me and that person, love, it's all good. So that was sort of like my first steps into realizing that I do love myself. I've just sort of haven't like earmarked it properly, hadn't like owned it and basked in it. I hadn't let myself enjoy the love I was feeling for other things and realize that that was for me as well. And I'd say that the unconditional love is still a journey because, as we discussed, shame comes in and diminishes our yes feelings, and love is a yes feeling. So it's kind of for me about really honoring that when I'm not feeling unconditional love, it doesn't mean it's not there. The opportunity to like find that love and compassion for anyone or anything is available, but I have to get through the shame first, or the fear first, or the trigger first. So it's like, I don't have to be feeling love to believe that love is possible. And that little belief right there, that sense of hope and like, okay, where, how do I need to get through this? How do I need to move through this to reconnect with a sense of love or compassion? That's sort of like unconditional love in theory. I don't feel unconditional love in every moment, and I probably never will. But I have this theoretical basis for unconditional love that I can cling on to, which is just hopefulness and faith that every emotion is temporary and I'll move through it and come to something more meaningful and useful after. Does that make sense?
Yeah, something like there's a higher abstraction level wherein it's like a meta unconditional love that's always there, and periodically there's a process by which you can reach to it if you feel like you're disconnected from it, and then that sort of how it translates down to how you apply what's happening in your present life in the moment takes different forms, such as having a hope and sort of a larger frame of a time frame for how long, how feelings now will unfold over a course of time, and how that fits into how you're engaging it and a number of other things. So also it was a very beautiful story about ayahuasca as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. It's like a scaffolding that I can kind of cognitively meta reach up to. And I think, again, to your larger question of like, what do we do with shame? I think a lot of us think that the solution is to shame is that we don't feel it. And that's just not realistic. It's a primary emotion in my understanding, which means we're always going to feel it. So it's about having like these meta structures to some extent, where feeling shame, just because I'm feeling deep shame, doesn't mean that I actually believe it or identify with it or act on it, because I have that meta awareness of, oh, this isn't really even me. This could be a trigger from the past. This message that I suck is wired into my brain. It's probably not true. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to kind of be able to see that and accept it long enough that it will pass naturally. I don't have to fight with it. I don't have to push it away. I don't have to repress it. I can just sit there with this voice being like, we suck. And I'm like, yeah, I can see why you're saying that. I get why you're here. I see what triggered you. I'm just going to babysit you until you fall asleep. And then on the other side of it, I will discover, oh yeah, I actually don't suck, just as I suspected.
So to finish us off, maybe, I feel like it was woven into everything that you just said there, but a lot of people don't have that sort of like meta scaffolding of unconditional love. What might be like sort of your basic 1, 2, 3 for navigating shame when it comes up for people who might want to just try applying it right away after hearing this interview?
I think a huge step is to get curious about it and talk about it. And shame can even be hard to notice sometimes. So I think there's a journey at the very beginning to ask yourself, if you're listening, okay, what is shame for me? What does shame feel like for me? To get that curiosity going so that you can start to notice it. And it's almost always in retrospect at first. Oh, I was in shame yesterday. That's what that was. And then once you start to go on this curiosity journey, I really encourage journaling and especially talking to people about it, because that tells your body implicitly that this is something that you contain, that you see, that you understand, not something that's bigger than you, that controls you, that tells you what to do. It's just like these gradual steps of teaching yourself, I'm in control of this to some extent. And I can also build deeper connection with my friends by talking about it. It's that old saying, what you name, you tame. It's very true for shame. So we want to just get curious about it, notice it, try to see if we can accept it and listen to it, and then talk to someone we trust about it. Maybe it's our therapist, but also like friends, family, whoever. I have discovered that talking about shame is very generative and creates a lot of intimacy because people feel safe to share things that they don't normally feel safe to share. So I think those are kind of like the basic steps. And in the end, that's kind of it. Can I see it? Can I stay curious and open around it? And can I talk about it rather than having it silently control me? Mm-hmm. That's like really, that is a pattern that never ends for me. Mm. And there's always new stuff.
Right. And I think it's important also, not every relationship is going to be the right relationship. Can I pause you for
1 second?
Yep.
I lost audio for some reason. Can you hear me? Can I hear you?
I can hear you.
I think my headphones died, so I'm going to put these in.
Hello, I can hear you.
I still can't hear you. 1 second. Just change the source.
Do.
Great. Can you repeat that question?
Do. Nice. Nardwar. Okay, so it wasn't a question, it was a comment, which was that and not every relationship is going to be the right relationship to share that thing that you're ashamed about or feeling shame with. Yeah. And generally, and there maybe is something there too about starting to wonder, not only just how do I feel shame, but are there relationships in my life where, even though I might not think it's safe to talk about, could there be places where it's safe to talk about? And with what sort of increments can I safely explore the actual safety of those relationships to open up in that way? And that itself might be its own sort of journey of starting to really wonder, where are my most valuable and treasured relationships and how safe are they? And how much opportunity for authenticity do they have around things that are deeply personal to me, which can be very affronting if it turns out at first that it doesn't feel that way. But almost definitely it doesn't take very long to find those relationships once you recognize they might be missing. Something like self-love. Once you recognized it wasn't there, it didn't take too long to recognize where it actually was. But you can't look for an unknown. And so with that, AJ, I would love to hear for the listeners where they can find out more about you, where they can get your book, which is up on screen here, Discomfortable, and where they might be able to follow up with the other things that you offer.
Yeah, probably the best place to start is discomfortable.net. That's my website. You can read about the book. You can order the book there. I do a podcast as well that's just restarting on shame and related topics. And I do coaching on shame as well. If people are interested in that, that's also on my website. I'm also on Twitter. You can just search Discomfortable or AJ Bond and you'll find me. It's pretty clear. I recently am doing more Instagramming. If you're interested in seeing a bunch of quotes, that's also an option. Also Discomfortable. And then the book is available pretty much any bookstore. It's kind of a specialty book, so your bookstore might not have it on the shelf, but any bookstore can get it. So you can just ask your local bookstore. That's probably the best way to get it if you want to support local, which is great. But you can also get it on the usual places. Like there's an Audible version that I read. It's on Amazon, and major booksellers will have it as well. So you can check that out. And and I think there's like lots of great resources on shame out there. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown. She's like makes it really accessible. She doesn't go into the science or theory space as much as I do. So she's a great introductory to shame if people are looking for that. And then like conversations with your friends, like you said.
Great. Well, discomfortable.net is the main access to your work. And I'll make sure these other links are contained in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com, where they always are to listeners who know. AJ Bond, thank you so much for helping us get discomfortable a little bit more so over time, and for providing your time to the podcast today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Great to see you again.
And cut. Okay, well, that was this interview with AJ Bond. If you enjoyed it, again, go check out AJ's work. Check out Discomfortable, the book, Discomfortable, the podcast, all of which available at discomfortable.net. And links are in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. Again, I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, this particular one was sponsored by Maps of the Mind in promotion of their upcoming workshop called Facilitating Psychedelic Experiences. If you head to jameswjesso.com/July 2022 workshop, you're going to find all the information about it. You could also use the promo code JESSO40, Jesso40, to only pay £40 for the workshop, which is approximately 23% off, which is pretty cool. Okay, so a little bit more about the workshop then. I'm going to look over to my screen here on my right, possibly it looks like the left to you, and read what we've got going on here. Facilitating Psychedelic Experiences is a 4-hour online workshop to help you improve your ability to successfully facilitate psychedelic experiences. We'll explore what it means to facilitate, dive into ideas with others, and consider what types of facilitators we'd like to be. Join us for this opportunity to connect with others and explore the topic in a fun and interactive format. You will leave this workshop with a greater understanding of facilitation and more confidence to organize your own sessions. The workshop is suitable for enthusiastic beginners, but will also be of interest with those with experience in the area seeking to connect with like-minded others. So we've got the sections that are set up here. There are 4 sections. We've got sitting, organizing trips, group sessions, and solo trips, as well as a Q&A. So that's some more information about the workshop. I'm going to be attending as an attendee, so hopefully you will see me there, or I'll see you there. And I want to make a note, actually, which is that I think that, at least I'm fingers crossing, that this workshop will be valuable. All signs seem to point towards it likely being a good time, or else I wouldn't have had it here on the show. And that I anticipate I'm going to learn quite a bit, and I'm looking forward to learning that. And hopefully you will get value out of it too if you choose to invest and participate and attend. But I do want to say that personally, I don't think a 4-hour workshop is enough to have you ready to facilitate other people's psychedelic experiences. And I hope that you don't go into this workshop thinking that that's going to be exactly and everything that you need. However, I do believe that if you are somebody using psychedelics or in a community of people using psychedelics, having some basic facilitation skills or perspectives is generally going to be a positive thing to bring on board in your own life, and maybe positive for those around you. If you ever happen to be called into the circumstance where you are the person helping somebody else through an experience. So with that little disclaimer said, maybe I will see you on July 2nd, 2022 for Facilitating Psychedelic Experiences. Again, Jesso40 is the promo code if you would like to pay only £40 for your attendance. And also, again, links are in the description to this episode and also in the show notes to this episode at jameswjesso.com. So that's the end of this episode of the podcast, episode 162. I hope you enjoyed it. And until the next one, take care.